Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love knowing who's out there listening. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 63 years old, and I live on the Kapiti Coast, about an hour north of Wellington. I spent 38 years as a civil engineer, raised 2 kids mostly on my own after my wife Margaret passed from cancer in 2009, and I've never been the sort of man who makes a fuss. Margaret used to tease me about that. She'd say, "Gerald, you'd apologize to the door if you walked into it." I'm telling you this because what happened to my older brother, what was done to him, nearly broke something inside me that I don't think would have healed. And the way it ended is something I never planned. But I'd do every bit of it again. My brother's name is Raymond. He's 4 years older than me, 67 now, and for most of our lives we weren't close. Not enemies, just distant. He married young, had a son named Clifford, and moved up to Northland when Clifford was still in primary school. I stayed south. We'd ring each other at Christmas, occasionally at Easter. That was about the extent of it. Some brothers are like that. Life pulls in different directions and you tell yourself you'll close the gap someday. And someday keeps moving further away. Then one night in March, at 10 past midnight, my phone rang. I was half asleep. I picked it up expecting a wrong number and heard a sound I hadn't heard since we were boys, my brother crying. Not sniffling, crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and private that a man his age doesn't let out unless something has gone very, very wrong. I sat up straight. "Raymond? What's happened?" It took him a long time to get the words out. And when he did, I couldn't make sense of them at first. He kept stopping, kept dropping his voice to almost nothing, like he was afraid someone nearby might hear. He told me he was cold. He told me he hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. He told me he was calling from a mobile phone that a neighbor's daughter had passed to him through a gap in a fence panel, and that I needed to come, that if I didn't come, he didn't think he was going to make it much longer. I asked him where he was. He said he was in the sleepout behind his own house, the one he'd built with his own hands 20 years ago on a 5-acre block outside Karakari. The one he'd always planned to use as a workshop when he retired. He'd been living in it for nearly 2 years. I drove through the night. 7 hours. I didn't stop, except once for petrol, outside Auckland. The whole way up, I kept telling myself there had to be some misunderstanding, some piece of the story that would make it make sense when I got there. People don't lock their fathers in sleepouts. That wasn't something that happened in real life. Not here. Not in New Zealand. Not to someone like Raymond. I was wrong about all of it. When I pulled off the main road onto the long gravel drive that leads to Raymond's property, it was just past 7 in the morning. The pohutukawa trees along the fence line were in full flower, red and brilliant, the kind of sight that belongs on a postcard. I remember thinking how beautiful it looked and how wrong that beauty felt given what I'd been hearing for the last 7 hours on the phone. I parked on the road rather than the drive. Something told me not to announce myself. I went around the back fence line on foot, moving through the long grass, and I found the sleepout at the far end of the yard, half hidden behind an overgrown banksia hedge. The door had a padlock on it, a proper heavy one, the kind you'd use on a storage unit. I knocked softly and said his name. The voice that came back through the wood was my brother's, but thinner than I remembered. Older, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. "Gerald, you came." I went back to my car, got the tire iron from the boot, and I broke that padlock off in 4 hits. I'm not a violent man. I want to be clear about that. But my hands were steady, and my mind was very quiet in the way it gets when I've already made a decision and there's nothing left to deliberate about. What I found inside that sleepout I will not describe in full because some images belong only to the people who witnessed them and to no one else. I will say this: there was a camp stretcher, a single blanket, a bucket in the corner, and a small plastic container of water. There was no heating, Raymond was wearing two jerseys and a pair of track pants that had gone gray from washing in cold water. He was thin, not dangerously so, but noticeably, in the way of a man who has been eating just enough to keep going and nothing more. His beard had grown long. He smelled of the cold and of damp wood and of something I can only call endurance. He looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, "When did this start?" And he told me everything. Raymond had retired at 64 after selling his building supplies business. A business he'd spent 26 years building from nothing, starting with a ute and a trade account, and ending with 12 staff and a warehouse on the edge of town. The sale had netted him just over $1.2 million, which he'd put into a combination of term deposits and a managed fund. The 5-acre property was his and had been since 1998. He had no mortgage. By any reasonable measure, my brother was comfortable. His son Clifford was 41. Clifford had worked in the business for a time but left under circumstances Raymond was vague about. I gathered there had been a disagreement about money and about effort. Clifford had a partner named Tricia, and together they had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who were 9 and 7 at the time I'm describing. They lived in a house in Karakari Township, about 8 kilometers from Raymond's property. About 18 months after Raymond retired, Clifford had started coming around more often. Raymond had been glad of it at first. He told me he'd felt the loneliness that retirement brings, the sudden loss of structure and purpose, and Clifford's visits had seemed like a genuine reconciliation. They'd have dinner together. Clifford would help with work around the property. There was talk of Clifford and Tricia moving on to the land, building a second dwelling, keeping Raymond company as he got older. Raymond, who had spent his whole adult life being self-sufficient and careful, let his guard down. And I understand why. He was 65. He was alone, and his son was paying attention to him. That's not stupidity. He was stupidity. That's not stupidity. That's being human. Over the following months, Clifford began managing Raymond's finances just to take the pressure off. Raymond signed a power of attorney. Then Clifford suggested Raymond add him to the property title, just so there are no complications if something happens to you, Dad. Raymond signed that too. Tricia moved a great deal of furniture and personal items into the main house, under the guise of helping Raymond organize. Raymond's car, a late-model Toyota Hilux, began appearing regularly in Clifford's driveway rather than Raymond's. When Raymond asked about it, Clifford said he was using it for work and would return it shortly. It was never returned. Raymond began to feel uneasy. He mentioned the power of attorney to a solicitor in town, a woman he'd used for his business conveyancing, and she raised several concerns about how broadly it had been drawn. When Raymond told Clifford he wanted to review the arrangement, Clifford became angry in a way Raymond hadn't seen since Clifford was a teenager. There was a confrontation. Tricia was present. Words were said that Raymond described to me quietly, without drama, as though he'd gone over them so many times they'd worn smooth. 3 days after that confrontation, Raymond found his access to his own bank accounts had been restricted. The week after that, the locks on the main house were changed while Raymond was out walking the property boundary. His clothes and toiletries had been placed in the sleep-out. Clifford told him it was temporary, that there was a process underway, and that Raymond should stay quiet and let things settle. Raymond was 66 years old, alone on a rural property, with no car, no access to his accounts, and his son holding the keys to his own house. He had a landline, but the account had been put in Clifford's name. His mobile had been taken. Clifford claimed it needed a software update and never gave it back. When Raymond walked down the gravel drive toward the road, Clifford appeared as if he'd been watching and told him to go back. I didn't know what to do. Raymond told me that morning in the sleep-out, his voice flat, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been frightened for a very long time. I kept thinking I'd handle it myself, that it would resolve, that he couldn't really mean to keep this going. That was 18 months of his life. 18 months of cold mornings and hunger, and the slow grinding humiliation of being afraid in a place you built with your own money and your own hands. The girl who had passed him the phone through the fence was named Isla. She was 8 years old and lived on the neighboring property. She'd noticed Raymond through the gap in the fence panels several times, seen him looking thin and sad. And one morning she'd pushed her mother's old spare phone through the gap with a note that said, "In case you need to call someone." Her mother didn't know she'd done it. Isla had charged it herself using a cable from her bedroom. I want you to remember that name. Isla. 8 years old. And she did what grown adults who'd passed Raymond on the road or seen him at the gate hadn't done. She noticed. And then she acted on what she noticed. I think about her often. I spent that morning in my car on the road outside the property, making calls. I rang a lawyer in Auckland who'd been referred to me by a colleague, a specialist in elder law and family property disputes. I rang the police non-emergency line and made a formal report. I rang my own bank to understand the process for contesting a power of attorney. I rang Raymond's solicitor, who confirmed she had already documented her concerns and was relieved to hear someone was taking action. And then I made a decision that I've since heard described by the lawyer, by my own children, by people in the comments of previous stories on this channel as either very brave or very stupid, depending on who you ask. I decided not to wait for the legal process. Here's why. The lawyer told me that contesting the power of attorney and the property title change could take months, possibly longer, if Clifford had good legal representation, which Trisha's family apparently had the funds to provide. In the meantime, Raymond was still in that sleep-out. It was autumn, and in Northland, that's mild. But winter was coming. Raymond's health had already declined. He'd lost around 12 kilograms. He was showing early signs of what the lawyer gently called prolonged stress response, which I understood to mean that staying in that situation any longer would do damage that couldn't easily be undone. Raymond and I are not twins, but we are brothers, and we look enough alike that people who don't know us well have sometimes confused us. Same height, same build, though I'm broader across the shoulders from years of fieldwork. Same gray hair, though mine is cut shorter. Similar voice, particularly on the phone. Clifford hadn't seen me in over 15 years. The plan was straightforward in outline and complicated in execution. Raymond would leave with me. I would take him to Auckland, to a friend's spare room where he'd be safe and warm and fed, and I would come back. I would come back, and I would be Raymond. Not indefinitely, just long enough to document what was happening inside that house, to establish clearly on the record what Clifford and Trisha were doing with Raymond's money and property, and to give the lawyer the material she needed to move quickly. Raymond didn't want me to do it. He said it was too dangerous, that Clifford had a temper, that I didn't understand how bad it had become. I told him I was 62 years old, this was 2 years ago now, and that I had no mortgage and no boss and no one telling me what to do, and that if not me, then who? He had no answer for that. We spent 2 days preparing. I drove Raymond to Auckland, got him settled, and then I drove back north. I'd studied photographs of the property on my phone, so I knew the layout. I had a small digital recorder in the breast pocket of the jacket I was wearing, a dark green swandry that Raymond confirmed he'd worn regularly and that Clifford would recognize. I had Raymond's detailed notes about the household routines. When Clifford came by, when Trisha came, what they expected to find, how they expected him to behave. The morning I went back onto the property, I came in the same way I'd left through the back fence line. I went into the sleep-out, and I waited. Clifford arrived at 10:30. I heard his ute on the gravel, heard the door, heard his boots on the back steps. The sleep-out door opened, and the morning light came in around him, and I looked up from the camp stretcher in the way I imagined a man who had been ground down for 18 months would look up slowly, without hope, without anger, without anything much at all. He didn't look closely. That was the thing that stayed with me. He didn't look at my face for more than a second. He slid a plastic bag inside the door. It contained a bread roll and a small container of leftover pasta. I found out later, and he said, "Water's in the container. Don't come to the house." And then he left. That was it. That was the daily welfare check for his 67-year-old father. A bread roll and 4 words. I stayed for 9 days. I want to be careful here about what I say, I observed, because the legal proceedings that followed required precision, and I don't want to exaggerate in either direction. What I can tell you is what I recorded and what was subsequently confirmed in evidence. During those 9 days, Clifford came to the sleepout 6 times. He brought food on 4 of those visits, always minimal, always leftovers. On the other 2 visits, he came to ask questions. Once about a term deposit that was apparently due to roll over. Once about whether Raymond had signed something that Clifford described only as the second document. I told him I couldn't remember. He became visibly frustrated and said he'd bring it by, and Raymond I could sign it then. He brought it on the 8th day. It was a document authorizing the transfer of the managed fund approximately $460,000 into a joint account that would then immediately close and transfer to an account in Trisha's name, alone. The document had been prepared by a solicitor. It was legal in form. It required only a signature. I said I needed my glasses. He said they were in the house. I said I'd need them before I could sign anything. He left, irritated, and came back with a pair of reading glasses that were not mine and could not possibly have been Raymond's. They were women's frames, presumably Trisha's, and told me to just use these. I held the document and looked at it for a long time, long enough that Clifford started to fidget. Then I put it down and said, "I want to ring Gerald first." The silence that followed was instructive. "What for?" "He's my brother," I said. "I want to talk to him before I sign something like this." Clifford said that I was hard to reach, and that this was time-sensitive, and that Raymond was being difficult for no reason. He took the document back and left. I heard him on his phone in the yard, speaking in a low, tight voice that carried the particular tone of a man explaining to someone that the plan was taking longer than expected. I had everything I needed on the recorder. On the 9th evening, a car I didn't recognize came up the drive. It was Clifford's Ute, followed by a second vehicle, a silver Subaru I later found out belonged to Trisha's brother, a man named Wade. Both men came to the sleepout door. I don't know what they intended. I'd been careful during the 9 days, but something had shifted. Perhaps Clifford had studied me more closely on the last visit, or perhaps Raymond had been spotted somewhere and word had reached Northland. Whatever the reason, when that door opened and both of them were standing there in the last of the evening light, I understood that the situation had changed. I stood up. I'm not a small man, and I was facing the light rather than sitting with my back to it. And I watched Clifford's face go through something complicated confusion first, then a kind of recalibration, then a slow and terrible understanding. "You're not him," he said. "No," I said. "I'm not." I'd already rung the lawyer from the sleepout that afternoon and told her I was coming in. She'd prepared an urgent application for the family court. The police in Karakari had been briefed. 2 officers arrived at the property 40 minutes after I made a single call. I'd had the number ready on my phone since the first day. What happened next was not dramatic in the way you might picture it. There were no raised voices, no physical confrontation. Clifford and Wade stood in the yard while the officers spoke to them. And then Clifford sat down in the grass with his hands on his knees and looked at the ground for a very long time. And I watched him from a distance and felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not satisfaction but a profound and heavy sadness. He was my nephew. I had been at his 5th birthday party. I had given him a cricket bat when he turned 10. I didn't understand how a child I had known becomes a man who does this to his father. I still don't, entirely. The legal process moved quickly, aided significantly by the recordings and by the documentation Raymond's solicitor had been compiling for months, and by the testimony of Isla's mother, who had noticed more than I initially knew. She'd photographed the padlocked door from her property on 3 separate occasions, uncertain what to do with what she was seeing. Those photographs proved decisive. The power of attorney was revoked within the week. The property title reversion took longer, about 3 months through the courts, but it was ultimately successful. The managed fund transfer had not yet been completed and was blocked. Raymond's accounts were restored to his sole control. Clifford and Tricia were required to vacate the main house. A protection order was issued. The criminal proceedings took most of the following year. Clifford was charged with unlawful detention, misuse of a power of attorney, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Tricia faced related charges as an accessory. Wade was not charged. The case was heard in the Wangare District Court, and I sat in the public gallery for every day of it. Clifford's lawyer argued, among other things, that Raymond had been living in the sleep-out voluntarily, that it had been his choice due to a dispute over household arrangements. The judge was not persuaded. The recordings, the photographs from the neighbor, the evidence from Raymond's solicitor, and Raymond's own testimony, delivered with a precision and a quietness that I thought was the bravest thing I've ever seen, made the argument untenable. Clifford received a sentence of 2 years and 8 months, with a non-parole period of 14 months. Tricia received a community-based sentence with conditions. The judge's remarks noted, among other things, that the treatment of an elderly parent in this manner represented a serious breach of the trust that society places in family relationships, and that the vulnerability of the victim was an aggravating factor that the court could not overlook. Raymond moved back into his house in late August of that year. I drove up and we spent a week there together, cleaning it out, reclaiming it room by room. We cooked dinner every evening and ate at the kitchen table that had been his parents' before it was his. We talked more that week than we had in the previous 20 years combined. At some point on the last evening, he said, "I never thanked you properly." I told him to stop there. He didn't, of course. He's 4 years older than me, and he's never in his life done what I told him. He said he was sorry for the years of distance. He said Margaret had always liked him, which was true, and that I should have listened to her sooner about a lot of things. I laughed at that, the kind of laugh that has some grief in it. Before I get to the end, I want to say something to whoever is listening to this. If you are elderly, and you have signed documents that you didn't fully understand because someone you loved asked you to please speak to an independent solicitor, not the one your family member recommends, your own. In New Zealand, the Protection of Personal and Property Rights Act gives you the right to revoke an enduring power of attorney if you have capacity, and there are organizations, including Age Concern and the Office of the Public Guardian, that can help you understand your options at no cost. If you are watching someone in your community who seems isolated, who seems thinner than they used to be, who appears at a fence line and looks out at the road with the particular expression of someone who wants to ask for help but doesn't know how, don't wait for certainty. A kind action taken on incomplete information is better than perfect inaction. Isla knew that at 8 years old. It shouldn't take a child to show us. And if you are a son or a daughter who is telling yourself that managing your parents' finances a certain way, or making decisions about where they live and who they see, is somehow in their interest, I want you to hear this clearly. It is not love that looks like control. It is not care that comes with a locked door. Whatever inheritance you're protecting, whatever debt you've convinced yourself is owed to you, none of it is worth what you will become in the process of taking it. Raymond is 67 now. He tends his property, grows tomatoes and courgettes in the back garden, and has recently started mentoring young tradespeople through a program at the local polytechnic. He rings me every Sunday. We don't talk about Clifford much. When we do, it's briefly, and then we move on to other things. He asked me once, not long after it was all over, whether I regretted the 9 days in the sleep-out, whether it had been worth it. I thought about the cold, and the camp stretcher, and the bread roll through the door, and the way Clifford had looked at me on that 9th evening when he finally understood. I thought about Isla, pushing a charged phone through a fence panel in the early morning because she'd noticed something was wrong and she didn't want to do nothing. I said yes. It was worth every day of it. He nodded. He looked out at the pohutukawa trees along the fence line, still and green now in the winter light. Good, he said. Now come inside. I've made a pot of tea.